So, for this brisket video, the following items were used. A Traeger smoker, a smokehouse blend of wood pellets, which the wood pellets were hickory, oak, maple, and cherry. A home blend of seasoning, that'll be gone over later. A knife so we can cut the fat and cut the meat when it's all done. Cutting boards, obviously, you're gonna need cutting boards for this. Mustard to help the seasoning adhere or stick to the meat. You can wear gloves, that is optional, but I would suggest if you're not going to wear gloves to definitely wash your hands. A digital thermometer, this is going to come in handy so then we'll know what the internal temperature is going to be. This is going to come in handy when we're getting towards the end stage of cooking our meal. A cube, we put this inside the smoker because it adds a little bit more wood flavor. A lighter or torch, we use this to ignite the wood pellets in that little cube. Or at least to get it to at least smoke. We also want cooking spray that's specifically non-stick to spray the grates before we put the brisket on. Also, I should have mentioned that in the event of bad weather conditions, it may be necessary to bring the brisket inside to get the internal temperature to the right temp. And that right temp is 195 degrees to 205 degrees. Let's just say Fahrenheit for now. So you want it between that 195 and 205 degrees, and that's going to let you know that the meat is done. Hi there, my name is Malcolm Wilkinson, and welcome to Millennial Meals. This is going to be a show where we show you how to make some delicious treats or meals right at your own house. And I thought, for the first episode and for the first meal, I think it should be something big. Something that's delicious, that's kind of like for the Midwest. So I think today's meal should be brisket. So before you bring your brisket home, when you're at the store, you need to test how much fat is in the brisket, because that's going to be important when you're cooking it, and also reduces the amount of work if you're cutting out a lot of fat. So when you're at the store, what you want to do is you want to see if you can't bend the brisket and almost have both ends touching. What this means is that there's not a lot of fat in this brisket, and not only that, that means it's less work for us to do when we start trimming all this fat. So now that we have the brisket out of its packaging, now we need to trim the fat. Now, based on the brisket that you picked in the store, will determine how much fat you have to remove from the meat itself. So a good rule of thumb is that you want about a 1/4 inch of fat on your brisket. Anything more, we want to kind of trim that off. And sometimes the brisket that you get at the store might be a little bit different, but again, the whole idea here is that we want to try and remove all this fat. And like I said, we want to leave about a 1/4 inch on the brisket itself. So after that, then we'll begin seasoning the brisket. All right, so now that we have the brisket trimmed, now we're gonna be able to put our seasoning or flavor or whatever thing you want to put on. So first thing that we usually put on is mustard, at least for our brisket, because the reason why is it kind of helps hold the seasoning a little bit better into the brisket. And not only that, it's good flavor. So make sure whatever thing you want to put on here, or at least in this case the mustard, that you put it on there nice and thick. Then if you're using gloves, you can. I personally am using gloves today. Kind of spread it over your brisket. So you kind of got it nice and even, because think of this as like the thing that's going to hold that seasoning or whatever thing you're going to use into your brisket. You might get it all over on the sides, the top. Okay, even the bottom. So keep in mind, when it comes to seasoning your brisket, you don't have to necessarily put any type of seasoning. A lot of times, smoking the brisket will already give it a fantastic flavor. But in some cases, for people like me, I like to add a little bit of seasoning to my thing. So in case you're curious of what type of seasoning I used or the ingredients, here's what I used and the ingredients as follows. 2 tablespoons of smoked paprika, 2 tablespoons of kosher salt, coarse, 1 tablespoon of black pepper, 1 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, and then finally 2 teaspoons of onion powder. Now, when you have these ingredients, obviously you want to kind of mix them together. Make sure you try to cut down on any really coarse and chunky bits. You want to make sure it's really kind of even, so it's as uniform and as mixed together as possible. And I would say the easiest thing to do as far as like trying to season your brisket, find a seasoning like a little salt shaker or some kind of seasoning shaker that you've used up, and just pour the ingredients in there, and then that would be the easiest way that you can use, or something that you can use to flavor your brisket, to shake some of that seasoning on there. So as we're putting on our seasoning, when you kind of get towards the edge, you want to make sure you're kind of like cupping it on the side, because I mean, we don't want to lose all of our stuff. We want to kind of keep every little bit of seasoning on our brisket, so we don't want to lose the concoction that we made or whatever flavor you're wanting to use. So again, like when you're kind of getting like to these edges, make sure you kind of cup it on the side, so then we can get every little bit that, you know, every little bit as possible covered with our delicious seasoning or whatever thing you want to use to try and make your brisket really pop. So after when you're done seasoning the fat side, I should mention that the fat side is what's going to be down when we throw this thing in the smoker. So then basically on the fat side, we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to season it as evenly as we can. When we get to those edges, we just make sure we have our hand kind of covering that side, and we just start seasoning. And I should mention that sometimes it's easier to do it when you have an assistant, but today I'm going to be the Lone Ranger making this brisket by myself. Alright, so depending on what level of your smoker, or at least what smoker you have and how much pellets you have, you might need to refill it. This one's kind of pretty much full, but I'm just going to top it off because, you know, why not? You have the ability to do it, let's do it right now. So on this Traeger, what we want to do is when I set about 225, and then what we want to do is we want to wait until the Traeger is 225 for a brisket. Alright, so one of the things that we use in the Traeger is called the cube, and with that you kind of fill it with wood pellets from top to bottom. And one thing that we usually do to make it a little bit easier to light, we'll put a paper towel inside the top, douse it with a little bit of olive oil, and then light it up. And usually what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get it nice and smoking without us having to maintain the fire. Once the cube is smoking nicely, we'll want to place it in the smoker and then spray the grates before we put our brisket in the smoker, and leave it overnight or whatever time frame you set. The main thing we're wanting is the smoker temp to be 225 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll have to resupply your smoker with more wood pellets as needed. Once it gets closer to being done, we'll want to put in our meat probe or digital thermometer to see what the internal temperature is. The temp range that we're gunning for is between 195 degrees and 205 degrees. Now, when the meat probe hits the temp range that we want, it'll be time to pull the brisket off the smoker. While it's doable to take the large brisket off the grill by yourself, it may be wiser to get some help with it. Alright, so now that we have our brisket here, we hit our nice golden temperature of 203 degrees on the inside. Now, at this point in the game, what we want to do is we want to let the brisket just sit here and rest, because we want the juices to kind of like seep back into the brisket. But we're going to wait about an hour and a half, and after that, we're going to cut into this delicious little, this delicious meal. But trust me, the wait is going to be totally worth it. It's going to taste great. It's going to be awesome. 1 hour later. When you start cutting, be sure to start at the flat end of the brisket, which is usually the smaller side of the brisket, the one that's a little bit lower and not as wide on the brisket. So when cutting, you want to cut against the grain of the meat as you slice off the portions you want. For brisket, the goal is to have a smoky, delicious piece of meat that won't fall apart, but instead is easy to pull apart and is tender. So after we have the hour and a half or hour wait time, it's time to cut the brisket. So when you're cutting the brisket, you're going to want to cut against the grain. So we're going to want to cut at this angle right here. Now depending upon how much fat or anything like that, your steak or your brisket could determine the moistness of the meat right here. But what you want to do is you want to try and cut some thin slices off, or you want to cut off a big chunk, you can do that too. But it's a lot easier to eat afterwards when you kind of got thin slices like this to serve people. Usually what I do is for serving sizes, I use about 5 ounces of this brisket, and that usually leaves me pretty nice and full. Now some pieces you're going to get are going to have a lot more fat on it than others, and the easiest way to tell on that is you'll see this white kind of squishy substance. That's the fat. Now personally me, I love having the fat on my brisket. I think it has a lot of flavor, but I know other people, they just really do not like having brisket with the fat on it. So the easiest way is just find someone in your house that likes the fat, give it to them, and then the people who want the leaner cuts of meat, kind of like this, that doesn't really have any fat on it, you just give that to the person who doesn't want any fat. But if anything though, I would say this is how you cook a brisket.